Here in England, we don't do Halloween like you do in the United States. At least we don't in Bolton, a sub-district of Manchester. A few children dressed in bin-bagged capes with witches' hats on or a skeleton mask will knock on your door holding up little pumpkin buckets out for sweets, and some neighbors will put out some sort of paper gravestones in their windows. You know, they go a little bit with it, but that's about it. Last October 31st, 2022, however, the weirdest thing happened at our home. Our family, we're all sitting at the front of the TV watching The Exorcist movie, when a hammer was at the back door. We all stopped and looked at it, and then looked at each other. To knock at the back door, you would have had to got through a wrought iron side gate, which is always firmly locked. The knocking continued, getting louder and more urgent. My grandson, who was 15, got up and went to the kitchen window to investigate. I heard a stifled gasp and went to join him to see what was happening. Despite being a teenager, he is 6 feet tall and does boxing training. So he's no real little weakling. I joined him at the window and asked what was the matter, face pale and confused. He said a massive bird-like creature had crawled along the lawn and crept into the corner of the garden near the back fencing. He was visibly shaken. The car parked to a country park nature trail is at the back of our fence. So I immediately thought some local kids were having a Halloween show and jumped to the wall. Despite it being 8 feet high, I thought maybe they were just pranking us. I told my grandson to tell the rest of the family what we had seen. And I told him I would check it out. He panicked, and I heard him shout to the rest of them still watching TV. He was shaken up at the crawling creature he had thought he had seen truly. I grabbed a torch and went out into the garden. We have a lot of mature trees, shrubs, and bushes. And at the corner of the garden, I heard a rustling. I pointed the torch toward the noise and walked towards it. There, with his back against the fence, was a bird-like creature about the size of a small child. It was perched on a grassy mound with eagle-like talons for feet, a smooth body, outstretched wings, and a pointy face that resembled a giant rat. I was confused and walked towards it while it looked at me with its head downwards, but eyes looking up at me. It spread its wings, and they fluttered like a bird when it was ready to take off. Then there was a prolonged hissing sound. I stopped and looked behind me for backup. I saw a few family members coming out into the garden. That thing gave one last hiss, rose into the air, looking more like a gargoyle than a bird at this point, and disappeared over the fence and made some of the shrubs waver as it went. My grandson and I described what we had seen, but the rest of them laughed and said it was just our imagination. They admitted to seeing the shrubs swaying, but they put it down to a giant kestrel or something. They didn't believe a word of it. To this day, I do not go into the back garden after dark. That was not a local kid enjoying the Halloween prank. Nor was a visiting kestrel. It looks like a church gargoyle. It's never been back, and I don't want it to return. So this year, if there's a knocking at our back door, my husband or son can investigate this time. I prefer lavender and lilac in my garden over cryptic creatures. Visions of Death by Sam. This story takes place when I was 16 years old. I had just been dropped off at school and I was going to the cafeteria. I went to sit with my best friend Jack. When I looked at Jack, I saw this creature that resembled a person but was covered in darkness, had no face or discernible features. He was standing right behind him with his hands on his shoulder. Not forcefully, but just like resting its head, then turned to me and followed me as I approached him. He asked me why I looked so spooked. I told him nothing because he didn't believe in the paranormal. He was a firm Christian. So anything I would have said, you would have just called me crazy. We went throughout the day, and every time I saw him it was right there with his hands on his shoulder. When I got home, I asked my mom what it could be. Or if my great-grandma might know. My mom told me she calls them reapers. They're not necessarily malicious or anything. They just comfort those who are going to die. I broke into tears after hearing this and ran in my room. I ended up passing out, and while I was asleep, I had a dream of my friend's point of view. It was in our friend's, Todd's vehicle, and he looked like he was listening to a speaker in the back seat not buckled in. Todd crashed into a tree. Jack went through the windshield and snapped his neck. And then I woke up screaming. My mom and sister came in to see if I was okay. I said I was fine. And I just had a bad dream. Nothing to worry about. The next day was a Friday and the Reaper followed Jack. I told Jack about my dream making, maybe I could warn him about what would happen. But I thought he would just call me crazy. The Reaper looked at me and shook his head. Wonder why it did this. Maybe it was telling me that I couldn't or shouldn't interfere. I ignored that. It was there for the rest of the day and went about my business until around 5 p.m. My friend called me and asked if I wanted to go to a party. I said, yeah, just come get me. And we'll go. He told me he had a ride and Todd would be there. I screamed at him. No, don't get in touch, truck. He told me to chill. He said he was on the way and hung up. So I went on my way to the front porch for him, hoping that my dream wouldn't be real. But after an hour of waiting, my mom got a call and told me what I hoped not to hear. Yeah, died to basically the exact same play-by-play I saw in my dream. I turned around and the Reaper was standing in front of me. It put a hand on my shoulder. I screamed at it to leave me alone. And it just disappeared just as it appeared. I don't know what happened. My dream came true. And it's something I'll always scratch my head about. I don't know what that creature was, if it really was a Reaper, quote unquote, or some sort of afterlife messenger. I don't know. But I don't want to find out. Thank you for sharing my story. This encounter still troubles me to this day. It was the summer of 2011. I recently turned 12 and my family thought it would be a great summer for a cabin trip. Normally, I would have been attending some sort of Boy Scout camp. Since we are from Florida, we drove north to South Carolina with my grandparents coming down from Canada to meet us. The cabin itself was beautiful, with a great view of the lake and its own beachhead. When we first arrived, I was first out of the car and running around and excitement. I was greeted by a man looking to be in his late 50s, the cabin owner. He smiled at me with happiness, which slowly grew into a nervous grin. Finding it quite odd and being a shy kid, I moved along. As I searched around the area being curious and wanting to see everything, I noticed almost a circular pit under the house. It was off-putting, but it didn't seem to bother me. Finally, I noticed a treehouse that the owner was building on the beach. As I ran to it, he yelled out, "Watch yourself, son, it's still dangerous." I steamed onwards and climbed up the ladder. The man was correct, as the top there were so many nails poking out all around. But since I was small, I found a place to stand and gaze back at the cabin. The wood cabin seems old but sturdy, with a big porch and outside storage underneath, where once again, I stared at the circular pet, which now had my full attention. It was nothing that I've ever seen before. And I don't think I've seen something like it since I love the woods and would like to say I am experienced, but it almost looked like a big spinning ball was dipped into the earth. I pointed it out to my father and the owner, who was talking. The owner responded with there used to be a bear that nested there. But don't worry, he's long gone. I didn't like his answer because it seemed strange for how it looked. I brushed it off and went into the cabin, picking up one of the bunk beds before my siblings could. The first few nights were amazing. Lots of hiking and swimming and everyday things that you would do. Because we knew when our grandparents arrived, we would be hanging out most of the time. When they did arrive, we sat by the fire at night and enjoyed animal watching. It's important to note the area's geography at this point. The front of the cabin faced a wide strip of dirt leading to the beach, with thick trees on either side. To the left of the cabin was the dirt road we used to get to it behind, and on the left of the cabin with thick, dense woods with a steep slope. Now, it was the 7th night that we were there. I was woken up by weird sounds outside, dirt shifting under weight to the left side of the cabin. The trash bins were there next to the door from the kitchen. I heard something pushing them around, thinking it was most likely raccoons or some sort of interested animal. I should do my Boy Scout duty and shoot them off. I dropped down from my bunk and the noises went silent. I noticed a few rays of sunlight were streaking through the air. I walked over to the kitchen to look out the window. But before it could reach it, suddenly, these long scratching noises were coming out from against the walls of the cabin. It sounds like long nails digging deep into the sheets of a bed. Terrified at this point, I slowly back away, then a bang shook the door and I jumped. Since it was only me, my brother, and my dog who were downstairs. We were the only ones who heard it. Instantly my dog sprinted to the door barking and growling viciously like he was about to fight to the death. This woke up my brother, who panicked and grabbed me and pulled out his hunting knife. He looked down at me with reassurance and told me to get to my parents' room. He then pushed me upwards towards the stairs and ran to the door and opened it. He then went away with my dog that barks and running, getting distance as I ran upstairs, and I woke up my father. He ran out into the forest, but this cold 45. About 30 minutes later, they both came back, including my dog, who was limping. I've never seen my brother with the look he had on his face before that day, and he never had that look ever again. He's typically a very brave and capable older brother, and seeing him like that unnerved me to my bone. He was an Eagle Scout, and I was a Boy Scout. We had been in the woods, and we weren't really scared to get dirty. My dog had a stick through his front left leg. But he's a good strong boy and took it like a champ. My mother and grandmother quickly drove our animal over to the local vets. While they were gone, my father, grandfather, and oldest second brother and I looked around the cabin for evidence of the strange event. I was still incredibly nervous, so I kept close to the cabin and my father. The trash bins had gashed holes in them, almost like they had been punched open, and the wall above had deep claw marks in it, which standing from the level of the trash bins was about 6 feet into the air. That's when I noticed an odd smell that wasn't coming from the trash cans. I slowly crouched down between peering underneath the cabin and where the strange pit was. There was a dead fox shredded into literal pieces. I told my father, and him and my brother quickly cleaned it up by using a shovel and tossing it into a bag and then into the trash. My dad contacted the owner, who assured us that there was nothing to be worried about, but brought us a flare gun and bear mace. A couple of days go by and my parents take everyone to a restaurant aside from myself, my oldest brother who chased the perpetrator injured but stable dog. An hour after they left, I looked out the second-floor window in the direction where my brother ran a few nights prior. I was petting my dog at the same time. That's when the main encounter took place. My dog raised his head alert and sniffed the air. I glanced out the window and noticed this huge bear-like creature high up in one of the trees. It was smashing my level when was staring at me. I say bear-like because I had human-like features, instead of the fat round body bears usually have. Their body was toned, sharp and muscular. The eyes were the worst parts. They were piercing. There were yellow, almost like perfect human eyes that locked eye contact with me. It flooded my brain and forced me into a fight or flight mindset. My dog, picking up on this, started growling and howling at the window. I turned to run another room and look back at a creature who was now rapidly descending the tree, using its claws hand to climb. I sprinted to my brother's room and tears yelling about this beast that I just saw. My brother looked at me with worried eyes and said, "This territory doesn't belong to us." Then he got out of his bed, grabbed his knife and baseball bat and walked downstairs. I armed myself with a flare gun, a bear mace, and prepared myself for the possibility of this thing breaking in and attacking us. A great slam into the back of the wall knocked the cabinet around. It made it rock like a boat and sent my dog into a frenzy. Between the growls and barks, I could hear heavy breathing from outside and things being thrown at the cabin. A rock broke one of the front windows, striking my left leg. I turned and fired the flare gun out of the window, which was followed by many profanities and yelling. After this, it all stopped. My dog was still growling and pointing at the corner of the room. There was no window facing that direction, so I couldn't see. But I could assume it was right there. A few minutes of silence went by when my brother and I decided to call the police and our parents, than being idiots. We walked out of the front door and slowly walked around to the right side of the cabin. We started to hear a slow snarl coming from behind a bush, and my dog, inside, started going ballistic and jumping at the door. My brother started yelling at this creature and threw his baseball bat towards the bush, striking it. It sounded like a hit a tree. But we both know that we hit the creature because it let out a pain to grunt. The blackberry mass sprung out from behind the bush and bolted down the dirt road, and we quickly lost sight of it. We hurried back inside the cabin, barricaded the doors, and ran upstairs. We heard gunshots ring out moments later and my father's truck pulls in. I fly downstairs and open the door. The rest of my family ran inside. And my father claimed a huge bear ran down the road and he fired a couple of rounds at it. The police eventually came after having a hard time finding the cabin. We gave them the story about this aggressive bear attacking the cabin. We left that night and my family likes to recall the story of how myself and my oldest brother fended off a hungry bear. But for me and my brother, that was not the case. When we arrived back in Florida, I went straight to my room still shaken up by what happened. When my brother came in, he looked at me dead in the eyes and said it looked human to it. I just nodded and asked him about his territory remark when he looked down and responded, "Every animal has its territory, and usually can keep it until something bigger comes along and takes it well. Something bigger came in, it took its own territory. Well," he said, "still makes me wonder to this day, it's burned into my mind." Looking back on it, the owner was so shaky around me, almost like he knew there was more danger in the area that he was letting on, and that he knew that we would be a target. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998. When I was 14 years old. My Boy Scout troop went hiking in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys of my troop were people I'd known my entire life. We were all very close and knew each other very, very well and trusted each other. We had been hiking for 5 days or so at this point. And it was pretty miserable. It rained every single day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry. We were covered with blisters and anything else you can imagine. The adults realized we had bitten off a bit more than we could chew and trying to do a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather. So we changed course and gotten off trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground, the kind of place with hookups for RVs and picnic tables and fire pits and such. There's also a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or any other house. There may have been a few other small groups there. But if there were, we never interacted with them or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including myself and my friend Jeremy, who like everyone else in our group we had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods, have a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind the cleanup, and about 10 or 15 minutes later, I followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. I remember the woods were totally silent. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance to the woods. I heard a noise from my left. I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy is standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet off the trail. The kind of pump where you raise and lower a handle to pump up water from a well. There was a strange light behind him. Like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods off the trail. I asked him if he was already done with the shower. He seemed kind of sad. He said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, My friends were all in there and I heard Jeremy talking in from the shower. All the blood rained out of my head and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were freaked out and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them exactly what happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot. This was long before any of us had experienced with any kind of mind-altering substances. But I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever. And we knew that we wouldn't exaggerate or play a joke on each other like this, at least not to this extent. I was physically shaking, it was almost impossible for this to be a joke. We all waited together. And so everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth and whatnot. Then we all walked back together in total silence. When we got to the spot, whoever I had seen was gone without a trace. The water pump was there, though. No one had noticed it before, because it was way off the trail and obviously non-use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed, thoroughly freaked out. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all my years since then, I've never been able to figure out what happened. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? This is unlikely. Did I hallucinate? Unlikely, but possible, who's to say? I was in the Boy Scouts as a kid in the South Carolina Low Country. We go on camp out about once a month. And one of the campouts that we used to go to regularly belonged to a local man who owned some land way out in the country and let our troop use it for camping. The actual campsite was in a wooded area in the center of a big open field that was maybe 20 acres or so. The guy who owned the land wasn't a full-time farmer. So we had plowed the field but never really planted anything. And the dirt was kind of settled and scrubby and grass had started to grow. I'm not really sure, I'm not a farmer. Maybe there's a name for that or something. Anyway, the western edge of the field was a dirt road that eventually led to the highway. The northern edge was an old field that was planted with trees long enough to go where the trees were fully grown. And it was basically a forest. The southern part used to be a forest, but it was now in the process of being turned into farmland. The trees had all been torn down, but not removed quite yet. So it was just a wasteland of fallen tree trunks and roots. The eastern edge was a swamp. And there's some nasty stuff in swamps in South Carolina. So we never really explored it too much. One night, after the post-dinner cleanup, everyone was kind of settling down for the night. So a few friends and I decided to go for a walk. There was a lone tree out in the field about halfway between the campsite and the western edge of the big field. So we walked out and sat under it. That was a full moon out. And the whole field was lit in this sort of luminescent type of glow. And we could see the edges of the field, but not into the forest swamp or whatever it was beyond. It was creepy, but kind of cool. We hung out for a while just kind of talking. And then we could see lights in our campsite across the field going out as people started to go to sleep. So we decided to head back. We got up and start walking. And I heard one of my friends say, "Who's that?" We all turned to look and there's this guy standing perfectly still about 100 feet away from us. We could see his silhouette very well, thanks to the full moon, but it was too dark to make out any details of his face. We hadn't seen anyone come from the campsite, but the guy looked like an adult. So we assumed one of the 4 adults who had been on the trip with us was out looking for us. My friend called out to him. And then this is where it gets really weird. Something that looked kind of like a wing slowly unfolded from this guy's head, and he remained entirely still. He lit up his long, low growling and hooting sound. Like imagine if a guy was trying to sound like a dog that was trying to imitate an L. We all took off running towards the campsite as fast as we could and did not stop until we got there. I looked back out into the field to see if we were being followed. But it was empty. There was nothing in the field at all. We walked around the campsite trying to figure out which adult was messing with us. But they were all in their tents and nobody had left the campsite. Nobody believed us, of course, they just assumed we had been out telling scary stories and freaked ourselves out. But I know what I saw. No, actually, I don't know what I saw. But I know it was nothing that we had brought out there with us.